It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God!
Horror is one of the most popular genres out there, and with this, icons are abundant, from slasher killers to gory creatures. But perhaps most recognisable of all are the Universal Studios classic monsters. Born out of the Gothic novel, these early movie monsters basically saved Universal's film studio from bankruptcy back in the 1930s. Although most people today may not have actually watched any of these classics in their entirety, which, if you haven't, I implore you to change that as soon as possible, but even so, most can still recognise their titular characters. A far cry from Mary Shelley's yellow-skinned and flowing black-haired Frankenstein's monster, it's Boris Karloff's bolted-necked and green-skinned Frankenstein's monster that most picture first within their minds. Some may see Gary Oldman before Bela Lugosi when picturing Dracula, but it is still Lugosi's widow's peak and cape that have come to make up the typical Dracula look today. With such a huge cultural impact, and more specifically, such an important role in Universal's history, many have long believed that the monsters should have a far greater presence within the theme parks. Thankfully, this desire is finally being properly answered by Epic Universe's Dark Universe portal. But prior to this, the monsters have not been completely absent from the Universal parks. In fact, they have unsurprisingly played a crucial role in establishing the world-renowned Halloween Horror Nights event. Thus, as we all grow more and more excited for the approaching opening of Dark Universe, I thought it would be fun to take a look at all that has led up to this.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Universal's first foray into the business of themed entertainment was their Hollywood Tram Tour. They actually first introduced a tour in 1915, but stopped it in 1930 thanks to the arrival of sound cinema, and the concerns that these noisy tours would disrupt this new art form. But always aware that a tour would be a big crowd drawer, Universal decided to bring this concept back in 1964, largely to compete with Disney's money-earning theme park, Disneyland. This new tour utilised a tram to take visitors all around the backlot, and has been the central pull of Universal Studios Hollywood for tourists ever since. By 1964, Universal and the film industry more generally had a far more expansive history to cover. The studio had been operating for just over 50 years, so there was lots to show off. Part of this, of course, being their classic monsters. Still a part of the tour today, trams take visitors through Little Europe and past a small body of water. Little Europe played a role in many of the classic monster films, most notably serving as the village in Frankenstein. And then this small body of water actually served as the lagoon in Creature from the Black Lagoon. Sadly, when Universal began to add larger effects to the tram, the monsters were never a focus of this, and still today do not have a central role within the tram tour. Although murals have been recently added which are not only gorgeous, but a nice nod to these monsters so central to the studio's history. Thankfully, as we all know, Universal's themed entertainment attempts have far expanded beyond just the tram tour. 1975 saw one of the earliest additions to the studio tour. Land of 1,000 Faces, a makeup demonstration show, opened up as an expansion of the small-scale demonstrations that had become a popular part of the tour. As part of this new show, 2 visitors would have makeup applied to become Frankenstein's monster and the new bride of Frankenstein. Now, not relevant to the monsters, but something I have to mention is that towards the end of the show's run in 1978, the Incredible Hulk was added and would run onto stage grabbing victims before punching his way through a solid brick wall. This show closed in 1978 to allow an indoor theatre, Castle Theatre, to be built. This theatre first housed a new, more elaborate makeup-based show called Castle Dracula. As the name suggests, Dracula led this show, accompanied by his assistant Igor. Guests made up as Frankenstein's monster and his bride remained, with a new addition of a third guest who would become the Wolfman. An animatronic Phantom of the Opera was also featured in this show. This show closed in 1983 to make way for a non-monster related show, Conan Sword and Sorcery Spectacular. But thankfully, Castle Dracula wouldn't be the last monsters took to this theatre's stage. A makeup show much in line with this opened with Universal Studios Orlando in 1990. Universal's horror makeup show, previously titled The Phantom of the Opera Horror Makeup Show, or the gory, gruesome, and grotesque horror makeup show, features a video about Universal's makeup artist Jack Pierce, explaining how he created some of the designs for Universal's classic monsters, including Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Wolfman, the Mummy, and Bride of Frankenstein. Today, the show's conclusion features a Wolfman-like monster, but in the past, the Phantom of the Opera also appeared within the show.
Metamorphosis from human to horror are excitingly revealed in the gory, gruesome, and grotesque horror makeup show.
Next up for the monsters was Beetlejuice's Rock and Roll Graveyard Revue, which opened in both Hollywood and Orlando in 1992. In Hollywood, the Castle Theatre would be the location for this show. Multiple versions with slight variations were performed over the years, but all featured Beetlejuice and his Universal classic monster pals, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Bride of Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. The Phantom of the Opera was included in earlier versions of the show, but was later removed. In the show, Beetlejuice would use his powers to transform the monsters into a rock and roll band, something far more in line with the comedic tone of Beetlejuice rather than the legacy of the monsters themselves. This show closed in Hollywood in 1999, but lasted until 2016 in Orlando. And for anyone longing to experience this show once again, or perhaps for the first time, I have some good news. Beetlejuice has been rocking over in Universal Japan since the park opened in 2001, and shows no signs of stopping soon. Perhaps not exactly the ideal way to commemorate the classic monsters, but certainly not a bad time for anyone who enjoys weird theme park shows, like I know I do. For the monsters in this show, this would be the last time they appeared within Hollywood's Castle Theatre, but one final monster did take to the stage in 2009. Creature from the Black Lagoon, the musical, was only ever performed in Hollywood, and both opened and closed in 2009. This was a 25-minute musical, written specifically for the park in hopes to promote a modern version of Creature from the Black Lagoon, but this film was eventually never made.
Look out! He's gonna sing! What are you doing round here? See, I'm a dog, Peter, Freddy Krueger, old Jane Moby, yeah.
The failed musical was replaced quickly by a special effects show, which is now also gone along with the theatre itself. The theatre closed in 2022 and was removed in 2023 to make way for the currently under construction Fast and Furious Hollywood Drift roller coaster. I may be biased as a huge classic monster fan and someone who has only seen one, maybe two, Fast and Furious films, but I think it really is such a shame that this piece of history is now gone. Although, if the coaster is good, maybe it will win me over. But I do hope there is at least a nod to the monsters somewhere in this attraction's queue, like there is a tiny Beetlejuice reference in Orlando's Fast and Furious attraction, which likewise replaced this classic monster show. Another now gone bit of classic monsters within the parks was the Universal Studios Classic Monster Cafe in Orlando. Opening in 1998, this quick service restaurant featured decorations referencing Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. There was also a bit of theming inspired by the later 50s sci-fi monsters. For any horror fan that visited the park, this was a must-go, and is sorely missed by all, especially when Halloween Horror Night rolls around each year. As I'm sure we all know, the Universal parks of today are far more than just a tram tour and a couple of shows. Universal Studios Orlando and all the Universal parks that have followed since this one opened in 1990 have all debuted as fully fledged theme parks. But the Hollywood park actually took quite a while to begin to transform into a true theme park, and actually didn't open its first dark ride, which was the E.T. Adventure, until 1991, a year after the Orlando park opened. But since then, the park has only expanded and today is also a proper theme park. So you'd like to think that somewhere within this growth and expansion, the monsters have received their very own attraction, or perhaps even land. However, for most of the park's histories, the monsters have remained, for the most part, pushed aside. There are a few exceptions that did open in the 2000s, but these are not exactly or directly linked to the classic monster films of the 1930s and 40s. Universal had been very careful to preserve their classic monsters, never rebooting this franchise, but come 1990, they were ready to allow a little lapse in this strict no reboot rule. In the late 1980s, Universal approved of a proposed reboot of the 1932 film The Mummy, in hopes that this would birth a successful, low-budget horror franchise. After some difficulties getting this concept off the ground, Universal took until 1999 to release this low-budget horror film. Directed by Stephen Sommers and starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, The Mummy was a huge hit, and quickly received a sequel called The Mummy Returns in 2001. In order to promote this new monster sequel, the Hollywood Park opened up a new attraction, The Mummy Returns Chamber of Doom. Around the same time this opened, the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb was also introduced to the tram tour. This was a simple re-theme of the tour's finale, Revolving Tunnel, which lasted until 2013. The Mummy Returns Chamber of Doom was also a re-theme of a pre-existing attraction, taking the place of a promotional Chicken Run walkthrough. This new attraction gave guests an opportunity to walk through the haunted movie sets left over from filming The Mummy Returns. This did actually feature real props and set pieces used in filming the Mummy movies. Evidently a big hit, this small attraction inspired Universal to take the Mummy to a whole new level within their parks. That level being a roller coaster.
Dare to enter a world of fear with no way out. Face California's fastest and scariest indoor roller coaster.
Your souls belong to me!
Revenge of the Mummy, the ride. Coming summer 2004.
The Revenge of the Mummy opened in both Hollywood and Orlando in 2004, and in Singapore in 2010. All three versions of this enclosed roller coaster were manufactured by Premier Rides and are of course themed around the Mummy film franchise. In Orlando, it replaced Confrontation, and in Hollywood, it replaced the E.T. Adventure, the park's very first art ride. The track layout in Orlando and Singapore is identical, but Hollywood's version is a little shorter. In Orlando, the ride's storyline is that guests are entering the filming locations of a fictional sequel titled Revenge of the Mummy. The Q video talks about how the original Mummy film was made, and most importantly, how the film's fictional curse seemingly was proven to be real while filming, with various accidents and plague striking the cast and crew. The Mummy star Brendan Fraser is skeptical and refuses to wear the Magi symbol that the crew and locals are convinced will protect them from the curse. Fraser steals crew member Reggie's Magi necklace to get a coffee from those who won't serve him without it. Later, Reggie injures himself in a freak accident that's shown in the video, and then is seen being trapped inside a sarcophagus prop. After this cue, riders board minecarts and enter the tomb being used for the fictional filming and meet a partially mummified Reggie. The Mummy then appears and the coaster takes riders through his tomb of traps and terror. Hollywood's version is set in 1944. As an archaeological dig. Similarly to the Orlando version, this coaster takes guests into the tomb, where they of course encounter real curses and have to try and break this mummy curse. Although Singapore's coaster is identical to the one in Orlando, the storyline of this version is also different. Unlike the Orlando version of the ride, guests enter an Egyptian tomb directly, rather than through a movie set. Just like the others, the coaster then takes riders on a battle against the mummy's curse. However, in this ride, it seems the curse is not broken and the mummy's terror reigns on. Singapore's The Mummy Returns is actually housed within an entire The Mummy themed land. Called Ancient Egypt, this area takes guests to a historical adaptation of ancient Egypt during the 1930s golden age of Egyptian exploration. This zone relies heavily on the depictions of Egypt within the Mummy films. It's only home to one other attraction called Treasure Hunters, which is a mini-car ride around an abandoned Egyptian excavation site. There's also a quick service restaurant called Oasis Spice Cafe, which if you're visiting, I definitely recommend the vegetable samosas, which are delicious and thankfully not cursed. With the opening of the Mummy Returns coaster in Hollywood, the original walkthrough attraction closed, to be replaced by another monster reboot movie, also directed by Stephen Sommers. After the success of The Mummy, Universal wanted to widen this franchise to cover some more of their classic monsters. So 2004 saw the release of Van Helsing, inspired of course by the vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Within the film, Van Helsing encounters a number of monsters, including Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde, and a few werewolves. Thanks to this, Van Helsing was more an homage to the multi-monster movies of the late 1940s than the true classics of the 1930s, but still something for classic monster fans to get excited about. Although this excitement did not pay off for most, as the film was heavily criticised and ultimately halted any further efforts to bring the classic monsters to the screen. Even the in-part promotion of a walkthrough titled Helsing Fortress Dracula was not enough to convince many to see this poorly rated film. This walkthrough took guests into Dracula's crypt, and like the previous The Mummy walkthrough, it was full of actual props from the film. Inside, guests would encounter the vampires and werewolves being hunted by Van Helsing. As expected, Van Helsing Fortress Dracula did not last long in the park, as people forgot about the film pretty quickly. Sadly, with this failure, something else was also lost. Another Universal Van Helsing attraction that almost was. A Van Helsing Robo-Coaster G2 attraction was designed for Islands of Adventure. All we've ever seen of this is a topographical sketch of the layout. The coaster was supposedly planned to open in late 2006. However, it seems it was replaced by Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, which opened on the same plot of land intended for this attraction, using the exact same ride system it was designed for. This replacement was a wise decision, as Van Helsing was far from the success Universal wanted it to be. Although I can't help but quickly mention that for those who do long for a Van Helsing themed attraction, there is actually one over at Movie Park Germany, which is just as weird as you might expect. Despite halting any more films or another Van Helsing attraction at Universal, this walkthrough would not be the last time the monsters took up residence within this theme park space. In 2006, Universal's House of Horrors opened up, actually keeping pretty much all of the Van Helsing sets intact.
Dare to face your fears in the all-new House of Horrors.
Guests would queue past props and artifacts from Universal's horror history. Once inside, the walkthrough would begin in a Transylvanian graveyard, where the Phantom of the Opera would be lurking. Then, in the catacombs, Nosferatu and the Brides of Dracula would hunt you. Next came Ancient Egypt, featuring sets from the previous The Mummy Chamber of Doom, where you would of course meet the mummy. Then there was the toy shop, home to Chucky, a more modern classic monster who doesn't quite fit the criteria of what we're discussing today. There was then a psycho section and a morgue supposed to be reminiscent of the 2004 film Dawn of the Dead. Then came the Wolfman's Forest, full of shrubbery from Hollywood's closed E.T. attraction. You then entered Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, where the monster would lurch towards you. Finally, there was the meat butchering factory, home to a chainsaw-wielding maniac. As you can see, the monsters featured inside this attraction extend beyond just the early Universal classic monsters, paying homage to Universal's wider horror history. I only ever got to experience this walkthrough once, but truly wish that it was still there, even just so I could see the props in the queue again. This attraction stayed until it was replaced by the Walking Dead walkthrough in 2016. Sadly, no permanent horror walkthrough exists here anymore. There's many reasons why these don't work so well, such as the fact that many theme park guests don't want these intense experiences. Plus, they're rather expensive to staff and do become repetitive even for fans of these horror attractions. Thus, Universal opt these days to keep their scares for Halloween Horror Nights. Thankfully, you can still today meet some of the Universal classic monsters at the Hollywood Park during the day. Plus, in Orlando, they have been featured in multiple versions of the Studio Park's Nighttime Lagoon show, including in the current iteration. With all the current parks covered, that brings us on to the place that the Universal monsters have truly found their home, Halloween Horror Nights. Not always a staple, the monsters have become a frequent part of this event, having actually featured in the very first year's very first house, Dungeon of Terror, in 1991 within Orlando. The monsters are as much a part of this event's history as Jack the Clown. I won't list off every house or show they've ever been in here, as that would be a bit boring, but they've certainly had their fair share. In fact, since 2019, it has become the norm to feature the monsters in their very own house every single year. A lovely way to pay respects, and something I hope doesn't stop. In fact, one of my personal favourite bits of Halloween Horror Nights colliding with Universal's classic monster history occurred just last year, when the Universal Monsters Eternal Bloodlines house in Hollywood was built within Soundstage 12, the famed filming location of classics like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Bride of Frankenstein. Oh, and it seems that we're not yet done with the 1999 The Mummy, as this film and its sequel, The Mummy Returns, also both had houses in Orlando. Another notable moment is 2009, which saw a trilogy of monster houses at Orlando based on Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. Actually, this Wolfman house was based on the 2010 film, another failed attempt at bringing modern audiences to see classic monster-inspired movies. In fact, it is this film which inspired Universal to take a good hard look at what might make this concept work, ultimately leading to them deciding to start from scratch on what would be known as the Dark Universe franchise. Rumoured to be supposed to start with 2014's Dracula Untold, the last new classic monsters-inspired film to have a house at Halloween Horror Nights in Orlando and Hollywood, this franchise has had a bit of a complicated run. All claims of this film being tied to the Dark Universe were denied, perhaps due to its poor reception, and instead the franchise began with 2017's The Mummy. But with this film's generally negative response, this first official release led to Universal declaring the end of this effort to build a cinematic universe with the monsters. With this, a Bride of Frankenstein remake was cancelled, and the planned Invisible Man film went in a completely different direction. Released in 2020, this film was shockingly pretty well received, and this year, in 2025, the next monster film has been released, called Wolfman, but this one is getting rather mixed reviews. Perhaps we will see the Wolfman at Halloween Horror Nights this year, although after its failed little photo opportunity last year, I don't think that's too likely. It seems no matter what Universal do, whether they try for a cinematic universe or just go with standalone films, they can't quite get the classic monster movie remakes to work. Good monster movies are far from impossible, and thankfully, with the books that they are based on long in the public domain, we are far from dependent on Universal for them. In fact, even the classic monster movies made by Universal will soon be entering the public domain, meaning that Frankenstein's monsters with bolted necks and lightning-struck haired brides will be able to be referenced by all. So, that's it I guess. That's the full history of the Universal monsters within the Universal parks. Not much, unfortunately. But wait, what about the future? Well, thankfully, the future looks much, much brighter. Or should I say, much, much darker.
I am Dr. Victoria Frankenstein. Together, we will finish what my great-grandfather started. Show them.
Universal Orlando Resort is set to open up their third theme park on May the 22nd this year. Home to 5 immersive worlds, this park looks to be a dream come true for every theme park fan, especially those who are fond of Universal's classic monsters. After over 100 years of film history and 60 years of theme park history, the monsters are finally getting their very own immersive theme park land, a land which will be called Dark Universe, with no official ties to the failed cinematic universe. So it's probably best if we no longer mention this. Set to be a modern-day follow-up to the classic era films, Dark Universe is set in the dreary village of Darkmoor, where Victoria Frankenstein, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Henry Frankenstein, has continued to follow in her family's footsteps of monster making. Current experiments include bringing all of the legendary monsters under her control, an effort which backfires when Dracula starts a revolt. Guests will be able to experience this storyline in Monsters Unchained: The Frankenstein Experiment, a dark ride utilizing Kuka arm technology, the same that's used in Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, and the same that was planned to be used in that Van Helsing attraction that never came to be. Elsewhere in the village is a camp of mystics that are studying the curse of the werewolf. It's here that you'll find Curse of the Werewolf, a max-spinning roller coaster based on a 1941 Wolfman movie. Then an old windmill has become a headquarters for a local group of monster hunters that will serve as the Burning Blade Tavern, a quick-service eatery inspired by the fiery scene from the 1931 film Frankenstein. But for those of us who feel more like monsters than hunters, another dining option called Das Steakhouse, run by Dracula's thralls, might make you feel more at home. In fact, if you really want to play into your monster or monster hunter side, you can purchase a makeover at Darkmoor Monster Makeup Experience. DeLacy's Cottage will be another quick service dining option, more focusing on snacks, and is of course named after the family observed by the monster in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Pretorius' Scientific Oddities will be your go-to for all the monster merch your heart desires. The name a reference to the mad scientist featured in the Bride of Frankenstein film. Within this land, you will be able to encounter Dr. Victoria, Frankenstein's monster, Bride of Frankenstein, Igor, and the Invisible Man. As you explore, you'll also meet the local residents of Darkmoor, a monster hunter and a musician who weave enchanting tales of universal monster lore. All of this sounds like it will make up an incredibly immersive experience, and finally something worthy of the classic monster's legacy. As already referenced, Universal's original classic monster looks will be slowly trickling their way into the public domain, so Universal have debuted some brand new looks for these old timers, something Disney has similarly recently done with Mickey and his gang. Personally, I like all of these new monster looks, and I'm particularly fond of the decision to feature a granddaughter of the Frankenstein family as central to the plot, as this feels like the perfect homage to Mary Shelley, the real-life creator of the monster we all love. Finally, with no opening date yet, the monsters are also set to feature in one of the walkthrough experiences at Universal Horror Unleashed in Las Vegas. So there you have it. There's everything we know about the past, present, and future of the Universal Studios classic monsters within a Universal theme parks. Let me know what of this you ever got to experience, or what you would have liked to experience, or even what you're most excited for about Dark Universe. Personally, I find it very hard to pick, but I do quite look forward to getting my very own monster makeover. I also wonder if we'll see a Dark Universe themed house at Halloween Horror Nights this year. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out some of my other videos and the links in the description.